before I start. So just to give you a quick overview of CFDRN. So last year, the Caribbean Fashion and Design Research Network was founded by a collective of researchers with diverse interests in the Caribbean and the diaspora. So our goal is to highlight and promote the voices and histories of the Caribbean and interrogate the often overlooked aspects of design histories. So additionally, we aim to create platforms for like-minded researchers to share their work with a broader audience. Our aim is to widen our community and eventually produce content and also establish a journal. We also aim to do an in-person conference somewhere in the world, but of course that requires capital and support. So a little bit about myself. So I'm founder of Georgian Diaspora, a platform that showcases multicultural historical portraiture. I'm a cultural historian interested in the study of dress and art history. I also have a particular interest in the Black subject in art and fashion studies. I'm an associate lecturer of contextual studies, teaching fashion history and theory, and also the theories of culture, identity, and community. And I teach these at London College of Creative Arts. I'm also a recent recipient of the Collaborative Doctoral Partnership, PhD at Central St. Martin's and the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and my work will be on fashioning Black identities in early modern Britain. So that's a bit about me and what we're all about. So we're going to actually start with our speakers, Kevin Talma, Audrey G. Bennett, and Natasha Henry. Okay, so Kevin is our first speaker, and he gained a BA at Clark University in both international development and science, technology and society, and an MLA from California State Polytechnic University at Pomona. He has been practicing landscape architecture since 1988, apprenticing in California, Hawaii, Italy, and Barbados, before establishing Talma Mill Studios Limited in the 1990s. He is a leading Caribbean landscape architectural firm. Since its inception, the Talma Mill Studios has been at the forefront of developing Caribbean landscape architecture with global relevance. The firm has experience in all aspects of landscape design, urban design, environmental development, and tourism planning. Talma Mill Studios has been involved in many of the civic space developments in Bridgetown, Barbados, including Constitution River, Jubilee Gardens, Independence Square, Church Village Green, and Golden Square Freedom Park. So I'd really like to welcome Kevin Talma, and his title is Evolution of Civic Landscape Architecture in Bridgetown, Barbados. Hi, Kevin.
Thank you very much for having me. Should I share my screen and take it from my screen?
Yes. Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, there we go. My name is Kevin Talma, and I wanted to go through a quick presentation. I'm not an academic, I'm kind of a practicing designer, and I wanted it to kind of be a testimony, my testimony in terms of how I have experienced the whole idea of becoming a designer and searching for an aesthetic that I could ground myself in, that is true to the Caribbean, which turned out after all these years to be quite difficult to find. I will talk about the evolution of projects that we've worked on, and hopefully the photographs will help illustrate kind of how things change and where things could go. And probably end with a comment on where I've found the inspiration and also the information for my particular practice. My early influences, I was educated traditional landscape architecture program in California. While I was there, the diversity of students and professors was non-existent. I think the field of architecture has realized that that doesn't work in terms of growing the profession. It doesn't work in terms of the stakeholders that they service. So the discussion of diversity is a big item at the moment. And when I was studying, I was, just trying to learn how to practice the art and science of landscape architecture. And kind of coming out of it, I realized like I didn't have any references for anything that made sense to me or was relatable. So I ended up, if I had to say where my influences came from, they came from a sculptor, Japanese-American sculptor, Isamu Noguchi, Isamu, I'm not pronouncing it perfectly. And what got me about him was his abstract interpretation of nature and forms that were a little easier to digest than the kind of traditional European forms that I would have seen, predominantly in my education. I also identified with a famous Brazilian landscape architect by the name of Roberto Burle Marx. And I guess I kind of identified with him because he was dealing with tropical landscapes. He was dealing with them much differently than mostly landscape architects I would have been exposed to. But a funny comment, if you look at the top slide with the paving, this is a very identifiable form. Oops. This was a very identifiable form. And when since then, I've come to realize that this form is actually an African form, and gone through Portugal, where he would have picked it up and made it part of his language, his design language. For those who don't know, this is a quick map of the Caribbean. Barbados is far east, a small island, 21 miles long and a smile wide, they say. I think we're 7 miles wide, so we're quite small, but quite densely populated, 260,000 people. So a lot of stuff going on. This is a map of Barbados. You can see Bridgetown, where we'll focus on the projects. That's the capital city. Barbados influences. So this slide is really to just kind of illustrate coming back to Barbados to practice, the things that would have impacted anybody. And these are kind of common images. You'll see the chattel house, which is kind of the poor man's house. It was called chattel because when the slaves got out of slavery, they built these houses that were movable. So that form in the top left-hand corner is a very kind of Barbadian form. If you're a designer, architect, landscape architect, you would be referencing that. The slide immediately below is the great house, the plantation house. So we had those two architectural forms that, excuse me, that influence architecture in the landscape in Barbados. At the time, it's changing now, it was a monoculture of sugar. So coming out of the plantation life and colonialism, Barbados was a forested island, and then it was completely turned into a monoculture of sugar. And that top right slide is kind of the image of the landscape that I would have grown up with sugarcane fields spreading as far as I could see, punctuated by natural landscapes, which we call gullies, which are drainage canals going through the country. And you see the great house and the cabbage palm as a kind of form that identifies kind of the settlements, which were all centered around a plantation yard. And then at the bottom, the natural environment of the sea, the coastlines, wilder environment of the east side of the island. So this was the kind of imagery that I would kind of start to work with and identify with at a very basic level. The slide that's missing here is actually the people and our culture and our festivals. And I apologize for not showing a slide because I reference it, but I also get the feeling that it is somehow a borrowed imagery of what we perceive as African. So I'm not comfortable with it at the moment. This is a city, Bridgetown, quick aerial photograph. Pretty flat, 2 bridges, that's why it's called Bridgetown, and a river. An idea that we kind of started to think about in the revitalization of Bridgetown. We were involved in this idea of the emerald necklace and identifying open spaces and green spaces that can be developed and how they connect. And you can see they're kind of centered around the river and the central district as kind of public spaces. some older photographs which show the city, very colonial architecture. The public spaces were more about commerce and trade than recreation. This project, the first project I wanted to talk about, which I identify as like probably the first civic design in the country. This is in the city. It's called Queen's Park, a very important public space. And it was designed in 1909 by Lady Carter, who was the governor's wife at the time. And if you look at the imaging, it is populated by Barbadian people of all walks of life, but the forms that you see are truly European. One comment that I would like to make about Lady Carter, she probably was ahead of her time because she was informed by her travels to Nigeria before she came to Barbados. And she also designed the public buildings, that the Prime Minister's residence, which are called a Lara Court, which is actually a Nigerian name. And in this particular part, one of the elements, which is a bit incongruous with the image that you see on the screen, is that she also included an African hut as part of her design. But you can see clearly that it is a very Western European aesthetic that we're starting our journey in terms of civic spaces for the city of Barbados, of Bridgetown, Barbados. And then moving on to probably this was early 90s. This is an important space called Independence Square, which celebrates Errol Barrow, who is the father of independence. And you can see on the left, the broken trident and the aquamarine and gold colors from our flag. And that is Barbadian in its graphics. But if you look on the right, you can see the type of architecture that defines the park is still very much plantation forms, pillars and columns. And that is a reference to what designers, and we were involved in this project, would have thought was appropriate for a civic space that was important. So you can see how we are influenced. And this is all subconscious because I never really thought about it at the time. At this point in time, I was emerging designer, and I looked for forms that I could relate to and I thought were appropriate for a public space. But looking back at it, I could see how I was influenced by how I grew up and what I was exposed to. Probably a comment that I should have talked about earlier in my studies. We had no reference to anything south of Egypt. We knew about the pyramids, but the way I was taught history, even in Barbados in the 60s and 70s, is the African experience started after slavery. So I had no visual imagery from south of Egypt. Little bit of an evolution here. We moved into another project, Church Village Green, where there was a clear separation from what was done before Independence Square. There was reference to history, what was the historical nature of the site. There was a reference to Barbadian art. There was a graphic layout of the landscape architecture that is definitely not Chattel House and is definitely not Plantation House. It was related primarily to nature. So if you look in the corner here, there's this pond, which is basically a hole in the ground, since we're right next to Constitution River, and we're trying to reference the development of mangroves, which would have been there in the past. There's the reference of an old street for the village that occupied this space. This project is basically the front yard to the Central Bank of Barbados. And then along the street here, we have these seats, which are actually the stoops of houses. And you can see just by the photographs, there's a difference of reference. Nature is wild in this situation. The pond is just a hole in the ground. There's no fountain pumps or anything. The idea of the front stoop of a chattel house, which would have been on this plot of land post-slavery, is referenced in the seating. And then coming to just before COVID, we developed a design which was built during COVID for a site called Golden Square Freedom Park, which I think kind of takes that thinking a little farther. And what's important here, in my view, is that, first of all, the park was developed based on history of this particular man who is basically the father of our labor movement. So in the 1930s, when things were really rough for people of color in Barbados, he was an agitator, and he spoke about labor, and he became a hero, a Barbados national hero, because of his activities in that sphere. We had a large site which the government decided needed to commemorate him and be for the people, and it's in this location. So this is Independence Square location, and this is Golden Square Freedom Park location, immediately across the street from each other. This is what would have been there in the 1930s. Chattel houses, no electricity, no water, right in the heart of the city. So this is what he was fighting for, the rights of the working class. And then here we come with a image for the park, which is, you know, traditional design process and technology to create. But in developing this design, we were trying to stay away from the details and the graphics and the architecture that would have come from Independence Square. So you can see the architecture of the structures are very Spartan, and they are utilitarian, but at a scale that is kind of monumental, because we wanted to celebrate, and we wanted people to feel comfortable in it and don't feel like if it is something that they're really not familiar with in terms of that architecture. We included things, the yellow and blue are road tennis courts, so that's an indigenous sport that Barbadians identify with. So again, content needed to be very, very Barbadian. We took the idea of a standpipe, which is in the old days, you didn't have water to your house, but you had a standpipe, and that's where you got water. And that's where you gathered with your community to talk, but also to fulfill that function of gathering water for bathing and cooking and cleaning. We commemorated Clement Payne. So you can see a thread coming in here, which is basically where I'm going with finding that Barbadian aesthetic. It is the visual artist who is going to inform me and really kind of get me home to where I need to go. We introduced community walls, site art that reflects Barbadiana. Not always appropriate for public space, but in the context of budgets and politics and getting things done in the Caribbean. But these things seem to have been really successful in this particular park and resonating with the Barbadian public. And then we had graphics on park benches from young artists. So we took the traditional park layout and infused it with Barbadiana at every turn, you know, murals on top of murals. And then even the structures, the history of the Chattel House village in this space is remembered in, you know, what we call the ghosts of the villages. So those structures, sculptural structures, are to remind us in this new celebratory space that what was there before. So history is something that I'm looking to ground myself in. And again, public art that relates to Barbadiana. And the final piece in this particular park is the Builders of Barbados Wall, where all surnames in Barbados, you know, are represented and celebrated. So it's the people's place, including those who don't have surnames, which would be the first African slaves, which have kind of a mix of colloquial plus African names, and then those before, which were the native Amerindian Indians that inhabited the island. And of course, Rihanna found her name there, so she's happy. Last couple of projects I wanted to talk about were collaborations I did with artists, where, again, looking for this Caribbean aesthetic, we start to explore the idea that the plantation economy has done something to our landscape, which is changing, and we've realized that there's these plants that seem to take back over the land when the plantation landscape disappears. And we realized that they had a history of being used by Barbadians for medicinal purposes. And so this is a example of a installation that celebrates these plants. And that evolved into a further project with the same ideas called the Garden of Hope, which is a display area that again celebrates these plants. And you'll see that the aesthetic, and at least from my world, has started to change. You know, these walls are built from the clay on this particular land. So these are adobe, and the plants are all the medicinal plants. So, you know, I can identify different forms evolving from celebrating different materials and how they can be built. And finally, this is just a sketch. You know, in my sketchbook, I use sketching as a way to subconsciously develop ideas. And I've found, in summary, that where I find our aesthetic can come from is our visual artists, who seem to be able to generate imagery and forms that are a reservoir for us to draw from to help define landscape architecture, urban design. And that's where I see the inspiration for the future. And I think I might have gone over time, so I really thank everybody for giving me that time to talk about it. And I hope it was informative relative to the idea of developing a Barbadian aesthetic in urban design and landscape architecture. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Kevin. That was so enlightening. I'm looking forward to looking at questions for you to answer some questions, but we'll do that straight after everybody's done their presentation. So just to remind everybody, if you've got questions, which I'm sure you have for Kevin, can you make sure you leave them until after everybody's done their presentation? Thanks ever so much, Kevin.
You're welcome.
Okay. Right, so we're going to move on to Audrey G. Bennett. Okay, so Audrey G. Bennett is the recipient of the 2022 AIGA Stephen Heller Prize for Cultural Commentary. She is a 2015 Andrew Mellon Distinguished Scholar of the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and a 1997 College Art Association Professional Development Fellow. She joined the Penny W. Stamps School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan as a full professor with tenure in 2018. She was appointed an inaugural University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor in 2019. Professor Bennett is a naturalized American scholar of Afro-Caribbean descent, and she hails from Nassau, Bahamas, where she lived for the first 3 years of her life before moving to her parents' birthplace of Jamaica. After 3 years there, her family migrated to the United States and settled in northern New Jersey. I will let Audrey introduce her presentation. Hi, Audrey.
Hi, thank you so much, Serena, for that introduction. Again, my name is Audrey Bennett, and I am delighted to be presenting here today. Next slide, please. I'd like to preface my presentation by providing some background information relevant to the theme of the session. I'm a naturalized American scholar of Afro-Caribbean descent. I hail from Nassau, Bahamas, where I lived for the first 3 years of my life before moving to my parents' birthplace of Jamaica. This is the house I grew up in Jamaica. On the left is how most view it, poverty and lack. But on the right, you can see the incredible patchwork of recycled scraps, precisely, lovingly inserted into exacting positions to form a constantly evolving whole. It's not an aesthetic proclaiming design genius from the top down. It is one built from the bottom up, adapting over time, an interactive aesthetic that inspired me throughout my career. Next slide, please. After 3 years in Jamaica, my family migrated to the United States. I grew up in northern New Jersey with a single mom who cooked Caribbean food, played reggae music every Saturday morning, and alternated between speaking Jamaican patois and standard English. At the inner city elementary and secondary schools that I attended, my teachers spoke standard English, while many of my peers spoke what today is known as Ebonics. Graduating valedictorian from my high school, I traveled further north to pursue an undergraduate degree at Dartmouth College, which afforded me an opportunity to study Spanish in Mexico. Next slide, please. I had a brief rendezvous as a paralegal in New York City, law school bound, while simultaneously deferred at the Rhode Island School of Design. I enrolled instead at Yale School of Arts graduate program in graphic design. These multilingual and multicultural experiences, among others, molded me into the scholar I am today. I have a firm, unwavering belief that cross-cultural competency plays a critical role in designing effectively. Next slide, please. Currently, I am a professor of art and design in the Penny W. Stamp School of Art and Design and an inaugural university diversity and social transformation professor at the University of Michigan. I conduct interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary studies of socially transformative images using qualitative research methods and creative practice. Next slide, please. My research agenda diverges towards multiple lines of inquiry on the use of interactive aesthetics to facilitate or evoke interaction with lay people to impact the way humans think and behave towards yielding social justice. Next slide, please. Interactive aesthetics is a graphic design theory that I developed that aims to bring to the forefront two things. One, the graphic designer's ethical responsibility in understanding the social impact of what they design, and two, opportunities for remote collaboration that can facilitate stakeholder participation in the design process, including both end users as well as others like clients, printers, etc. Next slide, please. When we communicate visually, we cannot assume that visual language is universal and that we have the cultural background needed to compose visual experiences for all cultural contexts, unless we're fluent in the culture of the community who will interact with the design outcome. Berlow's model of communication states that if the cultural background of the designer does not match that of the audience, then the audience cannot decode the intended message. But Berlow's model leaves out the dynamic over time, the ways in which we gradually build understanding through trial and error. If I am truly interested in communication across cultures, it is in their mutual interactions and co-constructions that the most interesting messages will be built. Even if it is between a computer and a person, the best interactions will be the ones in which the computers are not simply affecting us, but we are also impacting the algorithms in ways that enrich our own lives. Then there's, next slide, please. Then there's Hofstede, who defines culture as 3 levels of fixed influences. This view that our capabilities are frozen in genetics and culture and personality, the foundations of racial myths and destructive impacts on self-esteem for children. Interactive aesthetics recognizes that communication is not just receiving, but also creating social constructions. Sexism isn't built into boys' genes. It is built when they are told claims about their genes, about certain ways of being male. Interactive aesthetics does not merely react to what it exists. It helps us think about how our self-conceptions of nature and culture and personality can change and evolve in the ways that benefit humanity. Next slide, please. In this image, a photograph, cornrow hairstyling is specific to a group of people, and the technique, a kind of programming of the mind, Hofstede might say, is passed down from one generation to the next. The particular cornrow hairstyle reflects this person's personality or style, but according to anthropologist Ron Eglash in his 1999 book titled African Fractals, on a deeper level, this photograph captures indigenous computing in action as the braider uses computational thinking to braid the customer's hair, an indigenous cultural practice originating in Africa centuries ago. This is where interactive aesthetics becomes needed and necessary in engaging viewers with the multiple levels of meaning embedded in this particular photograph and in the practice of cornrow hairstyling. Next slide, please. For my graduate thesis at Yale, I was researching the visualization of memories, cycles, and legacy. Graphic designer Saki Mafundikwa was my thesis advisor. It was through Saki that I came across a sculptural art called a lukasa, that is, a memory board of the Luba, a secret society in Africa. It is coded with meaning where only those in the secret society are privy to its meaning. Again, Hofstede's perspective of culture as programming is particularly applicable here. But it wasn't until I met Ron Eglash at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute years later that I became aware of its algorithmic significance. We're tempted to think of the lukasa as simply an array of symbols like icons or text, but that fails to grasp its interactive aesthetics. It evolves over time, new beads are added, and these spatial patterns matter as much as color, size, and shape. That is why they are referred to as memory boards. The recursive accumulation of beads, clusters of beads, and clusters of clusters can be retrieved only by experts, just as recursive computing requires a higher level of expertise in coding. Next slide, please. In this particular aerial view of the city of Legon-Berny in Cameroon, built by the Kotoko, the largest building complex is the Palace of the Chief. Since this architecture can be described in terms of self-similar scaling, it makes use of the same pattern at several different scales. It is easy to simulate. As a result, using a computer-generated fractal, the same shape would be a rectangle. After the first iteration, we see how a small version of the original rectangle is reproduced. One more iteration gives a range of scales that is about the same as that of the palace. During Dr. Eglash's visit to Legon-Berny in the summer of 1993, the chief kindly allowed him to climb onto the palace roof and take a photo that you'll see in the next slide. The Kotoko are quite aware of the scaling aspects of their architecture. The reason for choosing scaling rectangles as a symbol of royalty becomes clear when we look at the passage that one must take to get to the chief. Next slide, please. So on the left is the photo that Ron was able to take. And then on the right, there is the representation of the passage as a whole, and as this kind of rectangular spiral. So each time you enter a smaller scale, you're required to behave more politely. By the time you arrive at the throne, you're shoeless and speaking with a very cultured formality. That's a fractal scaling of the Kotoko architecture that is not simply the result of unconscious kinds of social dynamics. It is a subject of abstract representation and even a practical technique applied to social ranking. These African settlements, or this one at least, and others are discussed in this article that was published by Ron in the Complexity Journal in 1998. This date is particularly significant, and I'll talk about the significance as we move forward. Next slide, please. The movement through the palace echoes the Fibonacci sequence and the golden rectangle. I was immediately reminded of my lessons on the golden section and constructing grids in my typography class in graduate school at Yale. I learned about how it undergirds Swiss design, which led me to question if Swiss design actually had African roots. Next slide, please. So the year that Ron published the article on African architecture, that same year, the late Sylvia Harris published her essay, Searching for a Black Aesthetic in American Graphic Design, and Steve Heller's edited collection titled The Education of a Graphic Designer. And in this essay, she observes that Black students studying graphic design tend to collectively display a kind of low self-esteem and confidence in regard to their making a significant contribution to American graphic design because they are unable to see what contributions their predecessors have made to the discipline. Next slide, please. Noting that Black students are basically still struggling with the lack of a Black aesthetic, and to address this problem, Sylvia Harris encourages students entering the profession of graphic design to translate Afri-Cobra and jazz rhythms, for instance, into graphic form. Next slide, please. And since graphic design traditionally fits within the fine arts, Harris encourages African-American students, design students, to also look at the work of African-American artists like Aaron Douglas, one of the leaders of the New Negro art movement of the 1920s, for artistic techniques and strategies to translate into graphic language. Next slide, please. She also strategically suggests that these students seek creative inspiration from the work of Caucasian artists and designers whose work shows the influence of African-American culture. Picasso first encountered African sculpture at the home of Matisse, which inspired his visits to the African section of the Ethnographic Museum at the Palais du Trocadero. Next slide, please. Not very well known for their relationship to African aesthetics are the tilings of Escher. On his visit to the historic Alhambra Mosque in Spain, he sketched the metamorphosis of tiles smoothly transitioning from one shape to another. But the Alhambra aesthetic, in which the images evolve across the page, was influenced by the North African Muslim tradition, itself carrying aesthetics from further south on the continent. Next slide, please. Returning to this need for a Black aesthetic, decades earlier, graphic designer Cheryl Miller asked the profound question, what is missing in the design profession as a result of so little input from the largest of all American minority groups? The article in which Miller asks this question begins an important conversation in the discipline on the impact of the absence of Black history and culture from graphic design's canon. As a result of this lacuna, Miller describes how Black students feel isolated, rejected, and at times inadequate within primarily all-white design programs. What is missing, arguably, is an acknowledgement of a Black aesthetic tradition that is respected and integrated into the discipline's canon and nurtured by new Black graphic designers entering into the profession so that it evolves. Next slide, please. In response to the lack of a Black aesthetic tradition in American design history around the beginning of the 21st century, I propose that the long sought after Black aesthetic may already be rooted in the mathematics of graphic design. In this paper, I propose the inclusion of ethnocomputing as a source for creative inspiration during the design process. Such an inclusion, I argue, can contribute new approaches to grid structures and imagery that correspond more to cross-cultural aesthetic preferences. These subsequent publications from then until now explore this idea further. Next slide, please. I'm currently pursuing a line of inquiry on the use of interactive aesthetics to diversify STEM along with the graphic arts and design by facilitating access to the heritage algorithms embedded in Indigenous cultural artifacts. For the past 22 years, since 2001, I've been pursuing this line of inquiry within a larger interdisciplinary research project on the development of culturally situated design tools that are led by my research and life partner, Dr. Ron Eglash, a key proponent of the school of thought known as ethnocomputing. So in contrast to colonial myths of primitives who cannot count beyond 3, various scholars, including Ron, who traveled to Africa on a Fulbright and discovered significant African mathematical practices like fractals. A fractal is a shape or a pattern that repeats itself at ever diminishing scales. So Ron wrote his book, African Fractals, but found that secondary school teachers were having difficulty translating the new knowledge from the book into their lesson plans. When he published his African Fractals book, he hoped that elementary and secondary students would be able to have that content adapted by their teachers into their math classes and their curriculum, but the teachers were having difficulty doing so. Next slide, please. So he asked me to basically join his team and collaborate with him on the design of a web-based platform that would be accessible 24/7 and comprise a suite of culturally relevant educational tools for teaching computing, math, and STEM using cultural artifacts and practices like cornrow braiding that involve transformational geometry and iteration. Next slide, please. As the website evolved, we conducted CSDT workshops at local boys and girls clubs, libraries, and even formal environments like math and computer science classes, art classes in secondary schools, as well as in elementary schools. What you're seeing now is an early version of the tutorial where we go through the concepts that are involved in transformational geometry and cornrow braiding. So we don't just tell the kids, okay, go to a website and learn how to use the software. We actually go through it with them step by step, integrating, their physical engagement with the interface, with learning the concept. Next slide, please. Here is, you can press on the screen and you should see, right? So here you see the interactive aspects of the tutorial. Can you press the screen again and press play? Is it appearing? Yeah, it'll come up. Okay, so here you will see the interactive aspects of the tutorial. She has one window with the example open and another where she's manipulating the coding blocks and entering parametric values such as the amount of rotation to apply in each iteration. This creates a loop between the eyes taking in information, the hand making changes, and the computing outcomes that become the feedback, a much more powerful way to learn than one-way delivery from a lecture or a video. Next slide, please. This is an early version of the CSDT software, the cornrow curves CSDT. It looks like this. And the students would use it to simulate the cornrow hairstyle of their choice at the right. So on the right, you see the image and you can actually click on that and choose a hairstyle to simulate. And on the left is a space where the simulation would occur according to whichever numbers, that you add to the interface. Can you proceed to the next slide, please? So in one of our first workshops, we asked students, where did cornrows come from? And the reply was that it was invented in the 1970s in Brooklyn, which is not correct. So it became very obvious to us that we needed to give some sort of historical training or background on cornrows. So we developed a history section that takes them through cornrows all the way through from their African origins to our contemporary era. We divide them into groups and have them read through each section and then report back to each other. Next slide, please. With culturally situated design tools, the kids are not limited only to African American culture. A crucial aspect of CSDTs is that students may use them to follow their interests. This freedom and independence allows for students to encounter new cultures, delve deeper into their own identity, or mix designs from different cultures to create something completely new. We've observed African American students choosing an Appalachian quilting simulation, Native American students choosing cornrow simulations, and even white students creating beadwork simulations, and so on. The cultural background alone can be transformative. When students learn that many Appalachian quills have the radical rows symbolizing support for abolition among poor mountain whites, you can see their views shifting. And their creative designs have all manner of mixes. Cornrows becoming powwow braids, yes, that's a thing. Graffiti simulations about Oaxaca, not to mention a whole realm of cross-disciplinary discoveries when students turn their African fractal simulations into plants and lungs and river deltas and other patterns from nature. Here, the students from Harlem Academy in New York simulated an Appalachian quilt using the visual block coding language of CSNAP. Next slide, please. Here, Afrofuturist textile designer Sally Kane takes inspiration from traditional African patterns, kelp fronds, and other elements to create combinations of natural and cultural design elements. Here, one of the students has extended her pattern to create the snake-like arrangement using the code that's on the left. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. And if you could click on the video, it will play. I'm going to end here. This is an animation of coded simulations done by BIPOC students using the quilting CSDT. And these examples are also accessible by way of csdt.org, the website, under the projects tab. So let me end by saying that indeed an untapped opportunity remains to pave a historical path from Africa to a Black aesthetic tradition in global graphic design. The collective development of an autochthonous Black aesthetic in graphic design would increase the confidence of Black graphic design students and encourage more of them to become graphic designers, and thereby help to diversify the student population at design schools and even diversify the canon of the discipline. Thank you so much. This goes on and on, so we can pause it here if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got so many thoughts about your presentation. Thank you so much. Ethnocomputing, it's amazing. I'm so glad to have heard you today. Thank you so much. Okay, now we're going to move on to Natasha Henry. So Natasha Henry, or Andy Henry, is the founder of a digital humanities project called Black Cover Archive. She's an independent collection of creative global magazines, and she's a PhD researcher and a graduate teaching assistant in media, communications and sociology at the University of Leicester. Her PhD research examines the production of fashioning Black bodies, and her social media handles are ND Henry and Black Cover Archive. Her presentation today is called Take Me Picture, the Caribbean Black Model in Fashion Portraiture. Hi, Natasha.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, then afternoon, evening, everyone. Okay, so thanks, Serena, for the introduction. This paper today will explore themes of photography, fashion, and portraiture in relation to the Black body. The themes are relevant to my own PhD research that examines the reconfigurations of racial capitalism, mode of production through the fashion actor networks of the fashion Black body from 1965 to 2024. Fashion actor network describes the macro network of non-human and human actors who act within the fashion world. Photography, portraiture, and fashion all act within that network of fashion. Photography and portraiture have played a significant role in the depiction of the Black body, whilst fashion as a system is in constant dialogue with the Black body that produces and promotes and wears fashion. We will begin with the relationship between photography and the Black body. Next slide. I think we're on slide 3 now. Okay, slide 3. It's a slide before, Ellie. Yeah. What's presented today is from Mark Seeley, and he states a key function of decolonizing the camera is not allow for photographers' colonial past and its cultural legacy in the present to lie unchallenged and unagitated, or to be simply left as unquestioned chapter within the history of the medium. The concept of photography is capturing and reproducing images. Photography emerged in the 19th century, and we have seen a remarkable technological transformation from the camera obscura to the iPhone or the Samsung phone. Next slide, please. The daguerreotype photography, 1839. In 1839, Louis Jacques Mandi Daguerre, a French artist in inventor, announced the daguerreotype process, which significantly improved the quality and reproduced exposure time compared to earlier methods. The daguerreotype quickly became popular and marked the beginning of commercial photography. In March 1850, Louis Agassiz, 1970 to 1973, commissioned J.T.Z. Lee to photograph enslaved people on the Edge Hill plantation in South Carolina, USA. Utilizing the technology of photography as part of his eugenics campaign, Agassiz chose 7 enslaved individuals, Alfred, Efsina, Jem, Jack, and his daughter Draina, and Renty, and his daughter Delia. These daguerreotypes were produced for scientific purposes to analyze the differences between European whites and African Blacks, and to implicate that the white race was superior over Black people. Next slide, please. Here in these 2 images are 2 like reconfigurations of these images. So the first is from what Here I Saw, What Happened, I Know I Cried. That's the title of the exposition. Clarice Weens adds the text to the images, challenges the viewer to consider the dehumanizing and oppressive aspects of these historical representations. The artwork seeks to confront the legacy of racism, colonialism, and historically subjugations of the Black individuals through visual imagery. It challenges viewers to reflect on how these representations have perpetuated stereotypes and distorted the understanding of African American experience in American society. The image on the right is produced by Sasha Hubers, and she uses a stapling method and photography for the first time. Using art to heal colonial traumas, Huber reproduced and printed the photographs on wood, dressed Renty in a suit inspired by the suit by Frederick Douglass. Her stapling methods to symbolize healing wounds while honoring the contribution of Douglass and Tubman. Ubbers gifted these portraits to Tamira Lena and her family, who were on the pursuit of obtaining these images. Next slide, please. Portraiture. Transforming these images into portraiture is significant. Historically, portraiture has been a prominent form of art, used primarily for wealth and powerful in society. Throughout different periods in history, wealthy individuals, nobility, and royalty commissioned portraits to showcase their status, wealth, and influence. Portraiture was often seen as a symbol of social prestige and means of immortalizing one's image for the future generations. Black portraiture has a complex history, often influenced by prevailing social and cultural attitudes towards race and identity. In many historical contexts, Black individuals were excluded or misrepresented in traditional portraiture, which perpetuated harmful stereotypes and narratives. Next slide, please. Rediscovering Black portraiture involves acknowledging and reclaiming the diverse and rich experiences of Black people through visual representation. With this body of work, Peter centers Black figures whose stories have previously been marginalized or erased. These new images address social and political concerns, but also originate from his own identity as a performer. Through reimagining representation from the 11th century to the present day, he dares viewers to consider how the global majority have and should be and portrayed. His solo expedition, Visible Skin, Recovering the Renaissance Through Black Portraiture, funded by the Wellcome Trust, ran on King's College London Strand's campus from October 2021 to February 2022. His work is featured in a new film commissioned for the Royal Albert Memorial Museum Landmark in Plain Sight exhibition. Slide 9. Next slide, sorry. Amago Bolfa is a contemporary Ghanaian artist known for his unique and expressive portraiture. One of Bolfo's notable artistic techniques is to use of bold colors, dramatic brushwork, and contrast patterns. His portraiture captures the essence and emotions of his subjects, showcasing their individuality and personalities. Through his artwork, Bolf seeks to challenge the representation of Black individuals in art history and to celebrate the beauty and complexity of Black identity. Slide 10. Fashion is said to be in dialogue with the body, so the body produces, promotes, and wears fashion. There was a stage where fashion was not in dialogue with the Black body, yet now the Black body is a signifier of fashion. Next slide, please. These are significant people in terms of fashion. The first person is Naomi Sims. Appearance on the cover of Life was a groundbreaking moment in fashion industry, as it challenged the prevailing norms and represented a significant step forward in recognition of diversity representation in the world of high fashion. The second individual is Dapper Dan. He's an influential fashion designer, entrepreneur, and Harlem street icon. He played a groundbreaking role in the fashion industry, particularly during the 1980s and 1990s, and he's impacted the fashion industry, pioneering street wear and logomania, influencing hip hop and fashion, defining Harlem style, confronting fashion exclusivity and collaborations with Gucci. Edward Enninful, the editor-in-chief of British Vogue, is a highly influential figure in the fashion industry, known for his groundbreaking work as a fashion stylist, creative director, and editor. These figures are just some of the Black people who have influenced the change in representation of Black people in fashion. Next slide, please. Caribbean and fashion covers. when you think about like Caribbean and the fashion covers, the first person who you think about for me was Naomi Campbell. Next slide, please. Naomi Campbell is considered one of the original Big Six supermodels, a term used to describe the most prominent and in-demand models in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Those models consisted of 5 other white models: Cindy Crawford, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, Claudia Schiffer, and Kate Moss. Naomi Campbell contributes to fashion. Her activism and her status as an international star icon have made her an inspirational figure and an enduring symbol of beauty and resilience in the world of fashion. This cover was taken for the cover of Vogue in 1987. This is what is where fashion photography and portraiture. This is where fashion photography and portraiture merged together to become a fashion magazine cover. If you click again, then it will transform into a fashion cover. Thank you. Fashion magazine covers are key to the fashion industry and serve as a platform to showcase the latest trends, designs, and personalities in the world of fashion. These covers often feature models, celebrities, or prominent figures from the entertainment, fashion, or cultural industries. There has been a shift in who is now featured on the cover. Even with the increase of Black visuality, there is still much needed exploration of Black models, Black visuality, and cultural production in the fashion industry. Next slide, please. These last 2 slides will feature fashion Caribbean models on the covers of fashion magazines. I would like to know if you are familiar with these models, as I only recognized a few. Start from the top left and go to the right and then go down. So that will be the order. The first model is called Melanie Monrose, and she's for the cover. She's on the magazine cover called The Cover for February 2016 issue. The next person is Jordan Dunn, and this was for Vogue Greece, and this was September 2021. The next person is Celeste Lopez, and this is for 944 magazine, and that was December 2010. And the last person on this slide was Joan Smalls, and it's for Pop magazine, and it was the SS 2012 cover. Next slide, please. Another 4 Caribbean Black models. Arlena Soares, and this is for Elle Canada, June 2019. And there's Janelle Williams for Love magazine, SS 2010. And there's Marie Eni Riviere Passable for Love magazine, issue 5, for winter 2011. And the last person is Cassie, the singer, also a model, for Harper Bazaar, January 2021. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Natasha.